During the division of my wife's inheritance, my son-in-law humiliated me. You're just a dumb plumber. Leave the inheritance to someone with a degree. What he didn't know was that my wife had left a surprise in the will. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I've been a plumber for 43 years, fixed thousands of pipes, unclogged countless drains, and never once felt ashamed of honest work. Until that Tuesday morning in Attorney Morrison's office, when my son-in-law Peter made me feel like the lowest creature on earth. Margaret had been gone for 2 weeks. 2 weeks since cancer finally claimed the woman who'd been my everything for 40 years. I was still wearing the same black suit from her funeral, still smelling her lavender perfume on my collar, still hearing her laugh echo in empty rooms. The grief was suffocating, but I thought at least her final wishes would bring some closure. I was wrong. The law office felt cold and sterile, nothing like the warm home Margaret and I had built together. Attorney Morrison, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, shuffled through papers while we all sat in uncomfortable silence. My daughter Sarah sat beside Peter, her face blank and distant. She'd barely spoken to me since the funeral, too consumed with her own grief to notice mine. Let's begin with the reading of Margaret Walsh's last will and testament, Morrison announced, clearing his throat. I straightened in my chair, my calloused hands folded in my lap. Margaret had always handled our finances. She was the smart one, the organized one. I just brought home my paycheck and trusted her to make it stretch. Whatever she'd decided was fine by me. Morrison began reading in that monotone lawyer voice. To my beloved daughter Sarah, I leave my grandmother's china set and jewelry collection. Sarah nodded quietly, tears starting to form. To my son-in-law Peter, I leave the summer cottage in Vermont and its contents. Peter leaned forward slightly, a satisfied smile creeping across his face. Then came the part that changed everything. The remainder of my estate, including the family home and all other assets, totaling approximately $47,000, I leave to my daughter Sarah Walsh Hoffman. I felt my stomach drop. Not because of the money, but because there was no mention of me at all. After 40 years of marriage, Margaret had left me nothing. Not even a personal item, a photograph, a single memento of our life together. Peter's reaction was immediate and brutal. Well, that settles it then, he said, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. Smart woman, Margaret. She knew exactly what she was doing. Attorney Morrison looked uncomfortable. Mr. Walsh, your wife did include a small note for you. He handed me an envelope with my name written in Margaret's careful handwriting. Before I could even open it, Peter stood up and pointed directly at me. You know what, Stephen? This is exactly right. You're just a plumber, a blue-collar guy who never even finished high school. What would you do with an inheritance anyway? Margaret was smart enough to leave everything to someone with an education, someone who understands how to handle money properly. The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked at Sarah, hoping she'd defend me, but she just stared at her hands. Peter continued his assault. 40 years of marriage, sure, but let's be honest here. Margaret was the brains of that operation. She managed the household, paid the bills, made all the real decisions. You just showed up with a paycheck and expected her to make everything work. And she did, brilliantly. My hands started trembling, not from anger, but from something deeper. Shame. Deep, crushing shame that maybe he was right. Maybe I had been dead weight in Margaret's life. Peter, that's enough, Sarah finally whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. No, Sarah, someone needs to say this, Peter pressed on, now addressing Attorney Morrison as if I wasn't even in the room. Stephen's a good guy, don't get me wrong. Reliable, hardworking, all that blue-collar nobility. But Margaret was college-educated. She had class, sophistication. She understood investments, savings accounts, real estate values. Of course, she'd leave the important stuff to someone who could actually handle it responsibly. I wanted to stand up, to defend myself, to say something, but what could I say? It was true that Margaret handled our finances. It was true that I'd dropped out of high school to work and help support my sick mother. It was true that next to Margaret's intelligence and grace, I'd always felt like I was punching above my weight. Attorney Morrison cleared his throat again, clearly uncomfortable with Peter's speech. Perhaps we should let Mr. Walsh read his note privately. Oh, I'm sure it's lovely, Peter said dismissively. Probably thanks him for being a good husband or something sweet like that. But the real business, the actual estate planning, that was handled by someone who understood how the world works. I stared down at the envelope in my shaking hands. Margaret's handwriting looked so familiar, so comforting, but Peter's words kept echoing in my head. "You're just a plumber, just a plumber." The meeting wrapped up quickly after that. Papers were signed, hands were shaken, and suddenly I was standing outside the law office feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Not just because Margaret was gone, but because her final act seemed to confirm what Peter had said. I wasn't worthy of her legacy. Sarah touched my arm gently as we reached the parking lot. "Dad, I'm sorry about Peter. He gets intense about money stuff." I nodded, not trusting my voice. She hugged me briefly, but it felt obligatory, like she was going through the motions. "I'll call you soon, okay?" she said, already walking toward Peter's BMW. I watched them drive away, Peter's words still ringing in my ears. Then I got into my old pickup truck, the one with paint stains on the seats and tools rattling in the back, and drove home to the empty house that was no longer mine. That envelope sat unopened on my kitchen table for 3 hours while I stared at it, afraid of what Margaret's final words to me might say, afraid they might confirm everything Peter had thrown in my face. When I finally opened it, my hands were still shaking. Margaret's note was short and simple. "My dearest Stephen, you were always my greatest treasure. Trust that I've taken care of everything. All my love, always, Margaret." I read it 20 times, searching for hidden meaning, for some explanation of why she'd left me out of her will. But there was nothing except her familiar warmth and that cryptic line about taking care of everything. What did that mean? The house felt impossibly empty that night. Every corner held memories of Margaret. The kitchen table where she'd sit with her morning coffee and crossword puzzle. The living room where she'd curl up with her romance novels while I watched football. The bedroom where she'd fallen asleep in my arms for 4 decades. I couldn't sleep in our bed. Instead, I spent the night in my old recliner, staring at photo albums I'd pulled from the closet. Picture after picture of our life together. Our wedding day in 1983, Margaret radiant in her simple white dress, me nervous in my borrowed suit. Sarah's birth, graduation, wedding day, vacations to the lake, backyard barbecues, quiet Sunday mornings. In every photo, Margaret was smiling, at me, with me. She never looked like a woman who was embarrassed by her husband or settling for less than she deserved. But maybe Peter was right. Maybe she was just too kind to show her disappointment. I found myself studying the photos differently now, looking for signs I'd missed. Did she seem frustrated when I couldn't help with Sarah's math homework? Was there disappointment in her eyes when other husbands talked about their business trips or promotions while I talked about fixing Mrs. Henderson's garbage disposal? The doubt was eating me alive. By morning I was exhausted and raw. The coffee tasted bitter without Margaret there to make it just right. Everything in the house reminded me that I was alone, and according to her will, I was supposed to be packing up and moving out soon. That's when I decided to go through Margaret's personal things. Maybe I'd find some answers, some explanation for why she'd cut me out. Or maybe I just needed to feel close to her again. I started with her jewelry box, running my fingers over the simple pieces I'd given her over the years. Nothing expensive or fancy, just tokens from a working man's love. Her engagement ring, a modest diamond I'd saved 6 months to buy, the pearl necklace from our 10th anniversary, the watch I'd given her when Sarah graduated college. She'd kept every single piece, even the costume jewelry earrings I'd bought her from the drugstore during our early years when money was impossibly tight. If she was embarrassed by my modest gifts, she'd never shown it. Then I moved to her desk, the little writing area by the bedroom window where she paid bills and wrote letters. The drawers were organized perfectly, just like everything else in Margaret's life. Bank statements, utility bills, recipes torn from magazines, birthday cards from Sarah. But in the bottom drawer, I found something unexpected. A small wooden box I'd never seen before, tucked way in the back behind her stationery. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all in Margaret's handwriting. Not letters she'd received, but letters she'd written. The first one was dated 3 years ago, addressed to no one in particular. "I've been thinking about Stephen today, watching him fix the neighbor's fence without being asked. He doesn't even realize how remarkable he is. 40 years I've been married to this man, and he still surprises me with his goodness. Peter thinks education makes you smart, but Stephen has something better. He has wisdom earned through kindness." My hands trembled as I read on. Sarah's frustrated with her father again, thinks he's too simple, not ambitious enough. She doesn't understand that ambition isn't always about climbing ladders or making more money. Stephen's ambition has always been to take care of the people he loves. Every early morning, every late night call to fix someone's emergency plumbing, every dollar he brings home, it's all been about making sure Sarah and I were safe and comfortable. There were more letters, page after page of Margaret's private thoughts about our marriage, about me. She wrote about the time I worked 3 straight days without sleep to fix the heating system when Sarah was sick with pneumonia, about how I'd secretly been paying for our elderly neighbor's grocery deliveries after her husband died, about the way I'd held her during her chemotherapy treatments, never once complaining about the burden. People see Stephen and think, just a plumber, she wrote in one entry. But I see a man who spent his entire life fixing things, making things work, solving problems with his hands and his heart. He fixed our leaky roof and our broken dishwasher, but more importantly, he fixed my loneliness and my fears. He built us a life, piece by piece, with nothing but love and determination. I was crying by then, big ugly sobs that shook my whole body. These weren't the words of a woman who was disappointed in her husband. These were love letters to our marriage, private celebrations of a life I'd thought was ordinary. Another letter, dated just 6 months ago. Stephen brought me flowers today, just because it's Tuesday. Grocery store daisies that probably cost $3, and he was so proud of them. Peter would call it cheap, unsophisticated. He doesn't understand that those daisies represent 40 years of Tuesday flowers, Saturday morning pancakes, and goodnight kisses. Stephen never made grand gestures because he was making small, perfect ones every single day. The final letter was dated 2 weeks before she died. I'm scared about leaving Stephen alone. Not because he can't take care of himself, but because he doesn't know how precious he is. The world tells men like my husband that they don't matter, that they're not important because they work with their hands instead of pushing papers. But Stephen matters. He's the best man I've ever known, and I hope someday he'll see himself the way I see him. I sat there surrounded by 40 years of memories and Margaret's secret love letters to our life together, finally understanding something important. Margaret hadn't been disappointed in me. She'd been protecting me, celebrating me, treasuring me in ways I'd never known. But that still didn't explain the will. If she felt this way about me, why leave me with nothing? Why give everything to Sarah and Peter? I was about to close the box when I noticed something else at the bottom. A small brass key with a number etched into it, 247. Attached was a note in Margaret's handwriting. First National Bank, safety deposit box, for Stephen. When the time is right. My heart started pounding. Margaret had a safety deposit box I'd never known about. Suddenly, her note made sense. Trust that I've taken care of everything. Maybe she had. I didn't sleep that night. The brass key sat on my nightstand, catching moonlight like some kind of beacon. Margaret's love letters were spread across the bed where she used to sleep, and I kept rereading them, trying to piece together what she might have been planning. By 6 a.m., I was dressed and waiting in my truck outside First National Bank. The morning was crisp, with that October chill that reminded me winter was coming. I'd always hated this time of year since Margaret got sick. Too many memories of doctor visits and bad news delivered in sterile rooms. When the bank finally opened at 9, I was the first person through the doors. My hands were sweating as I approached the customer service desk, the small key burning a hole in my pocket. I need to access a safety deposit box, I told the young woman behind the counter. Box 247. She asked for identification and had me sign several forms. My signature looked shaky, nothing like the confident scrawl I'd used to sign work orders for 40 years. Everything felt different now, uncertain. Box 247 is registered under Margaret Walsh, the woman said, checking her computer. Are you an authorized user? My heart sank. She was my wife. She passed away 2 weeks ago. The woman's expression softened. I'm so sorry for your loss. Let me get my supervisor. 20 minutes later, after showing Margaret's death certificate and our marriage license, I was finally led into the safety deposit box room. The supervisor, a middle-aged man named Mr. Chen, inserted his key alongside mine. Mrs. Walsh was a lovely woman, he said as we walked to box 247. She came in regularly, always very particular about her business. Regularly? I asked. Margaret had never mentioned coming to the bank for anything other than routine deposits. Oh yes. At least once a month for the past 15 years or so. Always very organized. Always knew exactly what she needed. The box was larger than I'd expected, about the size of a briefcase. Mr. Chen left me alone in the small viewing room with my hands trembling as I lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of files, each one labeled in Margaret's neat handwriting. Stock certificates, investment account statements, bond receipts, real estate documents. I pulled out the first file and nearly dropped it. Consolidated Edison stock, purchased 1985. Current value, $47,000. I grabbed another file. Microsoft stock, purchased 1986. Current value, $123,000. File after file, each one documenting investments I'd never known existed. There were utility stocks, blue-chip companies, government bonds, even some tech stocks from companies I'd barely heard of. Each purchase was modest, usually between $200 and $500, but the dates went back decades. At the bottom of the box was a thick manila envelope labeled for Stephen. Inside was a letter in Margaret's handwriting, along with what looked like account summaries from 3 different investment firms. "My dearest Stephen," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you found my little secret. I hope you're not angry with me for keeping this from you all these years." I wasn't angry. I was stunned. "Do you remember how you used to give me your entire paycheck every Friday? You'd hand it over with that proud smile, trusting me completely to handle everything. You never asked questions, never demanded an accounting, never doubted that I'd make it work somehow. That trust meant everything to me." My throat was getting tight. I remembered those Friday nights, coming home dirty and tired, handing over my pay with the satisfaction of a man who'd provided for his family. "What you didn't know was that I was taking a little bit from each check and investing it. Nothing you'd miss, just $20 or $30 here and there. At first, it was just for emergencies, but then I started learning about the stock market, about long-term investments. I got good at it, Stephen. Really good." I looked at the account summaries she'd included. The numbers were staggering. Margaret had taken my modest plumber's salary and turned it into something extraordinary. I never told you because I wanted it to be a surprise. Our retirement fund, our security blanket, our ticket to all those trips we talked about taking someday. I was going to tell you on our 45th anniversary, make a big production of it, show you how those small sacrifices you made, those extra hours you worked, had grown into something beautiful. I was crying again, but this time it wasn't from sadness. It was amazement, gratitude, and a kind of awe at the woman I'd been married to for 40 years. But then I got sick, and priorities changed. I realized this money wasn't really mine to give away in a traditional will. It came from your work, your trust, your Friday paychecks. It belongs to you, Stephen, all of it. The letter explained that the formal will had been deliberately simple, leaving only the house and basic assets to Sarah. The real estate, the investments, the accumulated wealth from decades of careful planning, all of that was held in accounts that would transfer automatically to me as the designated beneficiary. I didn't want Peter's greedy hands anywhere near this money, Margaret continued. I've watched him look at you like you're somehow less than him, and it makes me furious. He has no idea what real wealth looks like. It's not about degrees or fancy jobs, Stephen. It's about character, loyalty, and the kind of steady love you've given me every day for 40 years. I set the letter down and picked up the account summaries again, trying to make sense of the numbers. There were 3 different investment accounts, each one showing a current balance that made my head spin. Account 1, $847,000. Account 2, $1,240,000. Account 3, $923,000. I had to read the numbers 3 times before they registered. Margaret had turned 40 years of my modest paychecks into over $3 million. $3 million that she'd managed to accumulate without me ever suspecting, without ever touching our day-to-day expenses or compromising our quality of life. I was still staring at the papers when my phone rang. Peter's name appeared on the screen and something made me answer. "Stephen, where are you?" His voice was sharp, demanding. "Sarah said you were supposed to start packing up the house today." "I'm at the bank," I said quietly. "The bank? Why? Please tell me you're not trying to contest Margaret's will or something desperate like that." I almost laughed. "No, Peter, I'm not contesting anything." "Good, because that would be embarrassing for everyone involved. Look, Sarah feels bad about yesterday, so we want to help you find a nice little apartment somewhere. Nothing fancy, but clean and affordable. We're thinking maybe one of those senior living places where you won't have to worry about maintenance." The condescension in his voice was staggering. Here I was, sitting in a bank vault, surrounded by evidence of wealth he couldn't imagine, and he was talking to me like I was some charity case. That's very thoughtful of you, Peter. It's the right thing to do. Margaret would want us to take care of you. And listen, I know yesterday was hard, but you have to understand that emotional decisions about money never work out well. Margaret was smart to leave the real assets to people who understand finance. I looked down at the investment statements in my hands. Margaret had understood finance better than Peter ever would. Stephen, are you still there? I'm here. So we'll start looking at apartments for you this weekend. Nothing to worry about. We'll handle all the details. Actually, Peter, I said, standing up and gathering Margaret's files, I think I can handle my own arrangements. The confidence in my own voice surprised me. I spent the rest of that day at the kitchen table, surrounded by Margaret's investment files like an accountant preparing for the world's most important audit. Every document told a story I'd never known about my wife, revealing a financial genius who'd been hiding in plain sight for 40 years. The earliest investments dated back to 1984, just a year after we were married. Margaret had taken $200 from my paycheck and bought shares in a small company called Waste Management. I remembered that year clearly. We were living in our first apartment, barely scraping by, and somehow Margaret was finding money to invest. She'd been strategic about it, focusing on companies that provided basic services, utilities, waste disposal, telecommunications. People will always need lights and phones, she'd written in margin notes. She was right. Those boring, practical stocks had grown steadily for decades, but it wasn't just the money that amazed me. It was the meticulous record-keeping, the research notes, the careful planning. Margaret had turned investing into a science, tracking every purchase, monitoring market trends, reinvesting dividends with mathematical precision. In 1987, she'd written a note to herself. Stephen worked overtime for 3 weeks straight to pay for Sarah's school clothes, added $400 to the emergency fund, and bought more utility stocks. He worked so hard for us. The comment hit me hard. I remembered those 3 weeks, coming home exhausted, but proud that I could afford Sarah's back-to-school shopping without using credit cards. I'd never known that Margaret had turned that extra effort into long-term security for our family. As I dug deeper into the files, patterns emerged. Margaret had been incredibly disciplined, investing consistently regardless of market conditions. During the 1987 crash, instead of panicking, she'd bought more stocks at reduced prices. During the dot-com boom, she'd avoided speculative investments, sticking with solid companies. Slow and steady, she'd written in 1999. Stephen builds foundations that last. Our investments should do the same. There were also notes about expenses she'd avoided to maximize our investment capacity. Skipped hair salon today. Did it myself. Extra $30 for the mutual fund. Used coupons at grocery store. Saved $15. Every little bit helps. I'd never noticed these small economies. Margaret had made our life feel abundant while secretly squeezing every penny to build our future. She'd been a master at making much from little, turning my working-class wages into middle-class comfort and then into genuine wealth. The phone rang around 4 p.m., interrupting my document review. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. Hi, Dad. How are you holding up? I'm fine, sweetheart. Just going through some of your mother's things. That must be hard. Listen, I wanted to apologize for yesterday. Peter can be intense when it comes to money matters. He didn't mean to hurt your feelings. I almost told her about the investments right then, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way she said, hurt your feelings, like I was an oversensitive child who'd misunderstood an adult conversation. It's okay, Sarah. I understand. Good, because we want to help you through this transition. Peter found some really nice senior communities with reasonable rent. Places where you could make friends with people your own age. People my own age, like I was being put out to pasture. That's thoughtful, but I'm not sure I'm ready to move yet. Dad, you can't stay in that big house by yourself. It's not practical. The mortgage payments alone. The house is paid off, Sarah. I know, but there's still property taxes, utilities, maintenance. On your Social Security, it just doesn't make sense. I wanted to tell her that my Social Security was just pocket money now, that Margaret had ensured I'd never have to worry about money again. But something in her tone stopped me. She sounded just like Peter, talking about what made sense for my limited means. I'll think about it, I said. After we hung up, I continued reading Margaret's files. There was a section labeled Future Plans that made my chest tight with grief and amazement. She'd mapped out our retirement in detail, complete with travel budgets and healthcare projections. Stephen has always wanted to see Ireland, she'd written. First-class tickets, $6,000. 2-week tour, $8,000. Shopping and extras, $3,000. Total, $17,000. Easily affordable by 2025. She'd planned surprise trips to places I'd only dreamed about. Scotland, where my grandfather had been born. Alaska, for the salmon fishing I'd always talked about. Even a luxury cruise through the Caribbean, something I'd mentioned once after seeing a commercial on TV. He deserves to be pampered, Margaret had noted. 40 years of fixing other people's problems. Time for someone to take care of him. The tears came again, but they were different now. Not just grief for what I'd lost, but gratitude for what Margaret had given me. She'd spent decades planning ways to honor my hard work, to reward me for the sacrifices I didn't even know I was making. I was reading about a fishing lodge in Montana she'd researched when I heard a car door slam outside. Through the window, I saw Peter walking up the driveway, his face set in that determined expression I'd learned to dread. I quickly gathered the investment papers and locked them in Margaret's desk drawer. Some instinct told me to keep this discovery private until I fully understood what it meant. Peter knocked once and walked in without waiting for an answer, like he owned the place already. "Stephen, we need to talk." He settled himself at the kitchen table without being invited, looking around the room with that appraising expression he got when evaluating assets. "Sarah told me you're hesitant about moving. I understand that. Change is hard, especially at your age. But you have to be realistic about your situation." "What situation is that, Peter?" "Your financial situation." "Look, I know this is uncomfortable to discuss, but we're family now. I've done some calculations based on your Social Security and the small pension from the plumbers union. Even with careful budgeting, you're looking at maybe $1,800 a month in income." He pulled out a folder from his briefcase, spreading papers across Margaret's kitchen table like he was presenting a case to a jury. "Property taxes on this house are $3,200 a year. Utilities run about $200 monthly. Insurance, maintenance, unexpected repairs. You're looking at expenses that far exceed your income. It's just math, Stephen." I watched him arrange his calculations, his voice taking on that patient tone people use when explaining simple concepts to children. "Now, if we sell the house, after paying off the remaining expenses and settling the estate, you should clear about $45,000. Invested conservatively, that could supplement your monthly income by maybe $200. Combined with Social Security, you'd have enough for a modest apartment and basic living expenses." He sat back, satisfied with his presentation. "It's not glamorous, but it's realistic, and Sarah and I would help out with emergencies, of course." I looked at this man, who'd just spent 10 minutes planning my life based on numbers that represented a fraction of what Margaret had actually left me. He'd reduced me to a charity case without ever asking what I might want or need. "That's very thorough, Peter. I believe in being practical." Margaret was the same way, which is why she made the financial decisions she did. She knew you'd need guidance during this transition. The irony was staggering. Margaret had made financial decisions all right. She'd made brilliant financial decisions that would let me buy and sell Peter's entire life without missing a payment. "There's just one thing," I said carefully. "I found some papers of Margaret's that I need to have reviewed by a financial advisor, just to make sure everything's in order." Peter's expression sharpened. "What kind of papers?" "Investment documents, bank statements. I'm not sure what they mean." For the first time since entering my house, Peter looked genuinely interested. "Investment documents?" Margaret never mentioned any investments to Sarah. "They were in her personal papers, probably nothing significant, but I want to understand them." "I could take a look," Peter offered, reaching toward me. "I handle all our investment accounts. I might be able to explain them." "No, that's okay. I'd rather have a professional review them." Peter's jaw tightened slightly. "Stephen, if Margaret had any undisclosed assets, they would still be part of the estate. Sarah would need to know about them for tax purposes." "Of course, once I understand what they are." We stared at each other across the kitchen table, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the inferior party in the conversation. Peter sensed the shift too, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read my expression. "Well," he said finally, standing up and gathering his papers, "don't wait too long to get them reviewed. These things can be time-sensitive." After he left, I sat alone in Margaret's kitchen, thinking about the conversation. Peter's immediate interest in potential investments revealed something about his character that made Margaret's secrecy suddenly make perfect sense. She hadn't just been protecting our money from taxes or market volatility. She'd been protecting it from Peter's greedy calculations, from his assumption that he had the right to manage everyone else's financial decisions. Margaret had known exactly what she was doing. She'd given Peter and Sarah enough to keep them satisfied, while keeping the real treasure safe for the one person she trusted completely, me. The meeting with Attorney Morrison the next morning felt like stepping into a different world. This time, I wasn't the broken widower clutching an envelope with shaking hands. I was a man who'd spent all night reading financial statements and finally understanding the brilliant woman I'd been married to for 40 years. Margaret's investment advisor, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, accompanied me to the law office. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who'd been managing Margaret's accounts for over a decade. When I'd called her office yesterday, her assistant had immediately recognized my name. "Mr. Walsh, Mrs. Walsh spoke of you often," she'd said when we met. "She was incredibly proud of your work ethic and integrity. She used to say you were the most honest man she'd ever known." Now, sitting in Morrison's office again, I felt different. The same leather chairs, the same sterile atmosphere. But I wasn't the same man who'd been humiliated here 3 days ago. Peter and Sarah arrived exactly on time, Peter carrying his usual briefcase and wearing that self-satisfied expression he got when he thought he was the smartest person in the room. Sarah looked tired, probably worn down by Peter's excitement about potential hidden assets. "Stephen," Peter said, settling into his chair with authority, "I hope you've brought those investment documents." Sarah and I spent half the night discussing the tax implications of undisclosed assets. Attorney Morrison cleared his throat. "Actually, Mr. Hoffman, I've asked Mrs. Hartwell to join us today. She was Mrs. Walsh's investment advisor and can explain the financial arrangements better than I can." Peter's eyebrows shot up. "Investment advisor? Margaret had an investment advisor?" Mrs. Hartwell opened her briefcase with the crisp efficiency of someone who'd been handling complex financial affairs for decades. "Mrs. Walsh was one of my most successful clients. She began working with our firm in 1995 and built a remarkable portfolio over the years." "Portfolio?" Sarah looked confused. "Mom never mentioned any portfolio." "Your mother was very private about her investment activities," Mrs. Hartwell continued. "She preferred to handle financial matters discreetly, without involving family members in day-to-day decisions." Peter leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "How substantial are we talking about here? A few thousand? 10,000? Mrs. Hartwell consulted her notes. "Mrs. Walsh's total investment portfolio is currently valued at approximately $2 million. The silence in the room was deafening. Peter's mouth actually fell open. Sarah made a small, gasping sound. Attorney Morrison looked unsurprised, which told me he'd known about this all along. $3.2 million? Peter's voice cracked slightly. "That's impossible. Margaret was a housewife. Stephen's a plumber. Where would that kind of money come from?" Mrs. Hartwell's tone remained professional, but I caught a slight edge of disapproval. Mrs. Walsh was an exceptionally disciplined investor. She took small amounts from the household budget consistently over nearly 40 years and invested them with remarkable skill. She focused on long-term growth, dividend reinvestment, and compound interest. "Small amounts from what household budget?" Peter demanded. "Stephen barely made enough to support a family." That's when I spoke up, my voice steady and clear. "I made enough, Peter. Margaret made it work." "But $3 million? Sarah was staring at Mrs. Hartwell like she was speaking a foreign language. "How is that possible?" Mrs. Hartwell smiled slightly. "Your mother understood something many people don't. Wealth isn't always about the size of your income. It's about what you do with whatever income you have. Mr. Walsh provided a steady paycheck for 40 years. Mrs. Walsh turned that into financial security." Peter was frantically scribbling notes. "Okay, so this changes the estate distribution significantly. Sarah, as the primary beneficiary, you'll need to restructure the inheritance, the tax implications alone." "Actually," Attorney Morrison interrupted, "the investment accounts are not part of the estate distribution we discussed yesterday." Peter's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" "The accounts have designated beneficiaries that supersede the will. Mrs. Walsh set up the beneficiary designations years ago." I watched Peter's face as the implications sank in. His confident expression was cracking, replaced by something closer to panic. "And the beneficiary is?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Mrs. Hartwell consulted her paperwork. "Mr. Stephen Walsh is the sole beneficiary of all investment accounts, life insurance policies, and associated assets. The explosion was immediate. That's ridiculous. Peter shot to his feet. Stephen doesn't even understand basic finances. Margaret must have made a mistake or been confused, or Mr. Hoffman. Mrs. Hartwell's voice was ice cold. Mrs. Walsh was neither confused nor mistaken. She reviewed and confirmed these designations annually. Her instructions were very specific. Sarah looked stunned. Dad, did you know about this? I shook my head. I found some documents yesterday and called Mrs. Hartwell to help me understand them. This is all news to me, too. But that wasn't entirely true. Reading Margaret's letters had prepared me for something like this. She'd loved me, valued me, planned for me in ways I'd never imagined. Peter was pacing now, his lawyer brain working overtime. There has to be a way to contest this. Undue influence, mental incapacity, something. Sarah, your mother left you the house and basic assets, but this represents the bulk of the actual wealth. The house is worth about $200,000, Attorney Morrison noted, plus the contents and the Vermont cottage. The total inheritance outlined in the will comes to approximately $250,000, compared to over $3 million in investments, Peter said bitterly. It doesn't make sense. That's when Mrs. Hartwell pulled out another document. Actually, Mrs. Walsh left specific instructions about this situation. She anticipated there might be questions about her decisions. She handed me an envelope I recognized, Margaret's handwriting, my name on the front, but thicker than the note I'd received yesterday. This is to be read aloud if anyone contests the financial arrangements, Mrs. Hartwell explained. I opened the envelope with steady hands. Inside was a letter in Margaret's clear script, obviously written recently. To my family, I began reading. If you are hearing this letter, it means someone has questioned my decision to leave my investment portfolio to Stephen. Peter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Let me be very clear about my reasoning. Every dollar in those accounts came from Stephen's labor. He gave me his paycheck every Friday for 40 years, trusting me completely to manage our household finances. He never questioned, never demanded an accounting, never doubted my decisions. Sarah was listening intently, her face a mixture of surprise and growing understanding. I took small amounts from each paycheck and invested them. Stephen earned that money with his hands, his sweat, his dedication to providing for his family. The fact that I was able to grow it into something substantial doesn't change where it came from. I paused, looking at Peter, whose face was growing redder with each sentence. Peter has often made comments about Stephen's lack of formal education, as if a college degree determines a person's worth. What Peter doesn't understand is that Stephen has something more valuable than education. He has character, loyalty, and the kind of steady integrity that builds real wealth over time. Peter was staring at the table now, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Sarah, you received the house and physical assets because those represent our family home, the place where you grew up. That inheritance is about memories and legacy. The investment money is about security and future, and it belongs to the man who made it possible. I looked up at my daughter, who had tears in her eyes. Stephen has never asked for recognition or reward. He worked overtime without complaining, fixed everyone's problems without charging them, and gave me 40 years of unwavering support. If anyone has earned the right to financial security, it's him. The letter concluded with vintage Margaret practicality. Peter, if you're thinking about contesting this, please remember that I chose an investment advisor with 40 years of experience in estate law. Everything has been structured to be legally unbreakable. Save yourself the legal fees. When I finished reading, the office was completely silent. Sarah was crying quietly. Peter looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Attorney Morrison was making notes with professional detachment. Mrs. Hartwell gathered her papers efficiently. Mr. Walsh, if you'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss your investment options, I'm available tomorrow morning. As we prepared to leave, Sarah approached me hesitantly. Dad, I'm sorry. I never understood. I hugged her, feeling the distance between us starting to close. Your mother always said you were the smart one, Sarah. Now you know she was the smartest of all of us. Peter remained silent, staring out the window as if he couldn't quite process what had just happened. For the first time in years, he had nothing to say. Walking out of that office, I felt Margaret's presence beside me, her final gift of vindication and security warming me against the October chill. 6 months later, I was standing in my kitchen making coffee when I heard a car pull into the driveway. Through the window, I saw Peter getting out of his BMW, straightening his tie like he was preparing for a business meeting. I hadn't spoken to him since that day in Attorney Morrison's office. I opened the door before he could knock. He looked older somehow, the arrogant confidence replaced by something that looked almost like desperation. "Stephen, I hope you don't mind me stopping by." "Come in, Peter." He sat at the same kitchen table where he'd once calculated my modest financial future, but this time his briefcase stayed closed. His eyes kept darting around the room, probably looking for signs of how I was spending Margaret's legacy. The truth was, he wouldn't see much difference. I still lived in the same house, drove the same truck, wore the same work clothes. Margaret's money hadn't changed my daily routine as much as it had changed my peace of mind. "You look good, Stephen. Retirement suits you." I poured him a cup of coffee without asking if he wanted it. "I'm doing fine, Peter. How's Sarah?" "She's good. Really good, actually. The baby's due in December." That surprised me. "Sarah's pregnant?" "She didn't tell me." Peter shifted uncomfortably. "She wanted to, but things have been complicated since the will reading. She wasn't sure how to approach you." I understood. Sarah was caught between her husband's embarrassment and her desire to rebuild our relationship. The money had exposed the fault lines in our family, forcing everyone to confront truths we'd been avoiding for years. "She should call me," I said simply. "I'd like to be part of my grandchild's life. That's actually why I'm here." Peter cleared his throat, looking like a man about to swallow his pride. "Sarah misses you. She feels terrible about how distant things got, especially after we found out about your financial situation." He couldn't quite bring himself to say your wealth or Margaret's investments. Even now, he was minimizing it. "We were wondering if you'd like to come to dinner this Sunday. Sarah's been wanting to show you the nursery we're setting up." I studied Peter's face, looking for the angle, the hidden agenda. But all I saw was a man who'd been humbled by discovering he wasn't the smartest person in the room. "I'd like that," I said. Peter nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Good, that's really good." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking coffee and avoiding the elephant in the room. Finally, Peter spoke again. "Stephen, I owe you an apology. What I said that day about you being just a plumber, about not deserving an inheritance, it was wrong. I was wrong. I appreciated the words, but they weren't necessary anymore. Margaret's letters had healed that wound better than any apology could. I spent my whole life thinking success meant degrees and titles and corner offices." Peter continued. "But Margaret saw something I missed. She saw the value in honest work, in dedication, in being the kind of person people can count on." He paused, staring into his coffee cup. "I've been thinking a lot about that, about what really matters. And what have you decided?" Peter looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time since he'd arrived. "I decided I want to be the kind of man you are, Stephen, the kind Sarah can be proud of, the kind our kids can look up to." It was the closest thing to genuine respect I'd ever heard from him. Not because of Margaret's money, but because of what that money represented. 40 years of steady character, of quiet strength, of building something valuable through daily dedication. After Peter left, I walked through the house Margaret and I had shared, thinking about how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. The furniture was unchanged, the photographs still covered the mantelpiece, her reading glasses still sat on the nightstand beside our bed. But the weight of financial insecurity was gone. The worry about healthcare costs, about home repairs, about being a burden to my family, all of that had evaporated. Margaret had given me something more precious than money. She'd given me dignity. I'd used some of the inheritance, but not for anything flashy. I'd paid for the neighbor kid's college tuition when his parents couldn't afford it. I'd anonymously covered the medical bills for Mrs. Henderson down the street when she had her heart surgery. I'd donated to the volunteer fire department and the local food bank, but mostly I'd simply lived without fear. I bought good coffee instead of the store brand. I hired someone to clean the gutters instead of risking a fall at my age. I subscribed to the premium cable package and watched all the baseball games I wanted. Small luxuries that represented something larger, the freedom to live without constantly calculating the cost of everything. That evening I was reading in Margaret's chair when the phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, Dad. Peter said he talked to you today." "He did. Congratulations on the baby, sweetheart." "Thanks. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. Things have been so weird since Mom died, and then finding out about the money. I didn't know how to act around you." I understood her confusion. Money changes relationships, even when you don't want it to. People suddenly see you differently, treat you differently, expect different things from you. "You don't need to act any way around me, Sarah. I'm still your father." I know, but Peter felt so stupid about the things he said, and I realized I'd been treating you like you were some kind of charity case too. "God, Dad, I'm so sorry." "There's nothing to apologize for. Your mother and I chose not to discuss our finances with you. How could you have known? But I should have defended you better. When Peter was talking about senior housing and budgets and all that patronizing stuff, I should have stood up for you. Sarah's voice was thick with regret, and I felt the last barrier between us crumbling. Your mother defended me, sweetheart, every day for 40 years, in ways I'm still discovering. That's enough. We talked for another hour, about the baby, about names they were considering, about how she wanted to raise her children with the values Margaret had taught her. When we finally hung up, I felt like I had my daughter back. Later that night, I sat on the back porch with a glass of wine, watching the stars emerge in the clear October sky. Margaret had always loved this time of evening, when the day's work was done and the world grew quiet. I thought about Peter's apology, about Sarah's tears, about the reconciliation that Margaret's final gift had made possible. She'd known exactly what she was doing, not just with the investments, but with the way she'd structured the revelation. By leaving me out of the formal will, she'd forced Peter to show his true colors. His immediate dismissal of my worth, his cruel assessment of my capabilities, had been laid bare for everyone to see. And then, when the truth came out, his words had been exposed as the shallow prejudices they really were. Margaret had orchestrated my vindication as carefully as she'd managed our investments. She'd given me justice along with security, dignity along with wealth. A cool breeze rustled the oak tree we'd planted together on our 5th anniversary. Its leaves were turning gold, getting ready for winter, but the roots were deep and strong. Like our marriage had been, like the foundation Margaret had built for my future. I raised my wine glass toward the stars, toward wherever Margaret might be watching from. Thank you, I whispered to the night air, for everything. The wind seemed to carry back her voice, warm and loving like it had been for 40 years. You earned it, Stephen. Every penny, every moment of peace. You earned it all. I sat there until the wine was gone and the stars were bright, feeling more grateful than any man had a right to be. Tomorrow I'd call Sarah about Sunday dinner. Tomorrow I'd continue living the life Margaret had made possible. But tonight I just sat with the memory of her love and the reality of her trust, finally understanding that some gifts are too precious to be earned. They can only be freely given by someone who sees your true worth. Margaret had seen mine when I couldn't see it myself, and now finally I could see it too. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.